Well, what happened? Man didn't conform to the will of God. Article 14 says, "But when he was in honor, he did not understand it and did not recognize his excellence. But he subjected himself willingly to sin and consequently to death and the curse, lending his ear to the word of the devil. For he transgressed the commandment of life which he had received." Notice the emphasis here on who is responsible. He, that is man, subjected himself willingly to sin and consequently to death and the curse. He lent his ear to the word of the devil. He transgressed the commandment of life. He made himself guilty. And maybe you think, well, what about God? You just said this was some kind of probation, some testing. Did he really need to do that? And then I would say, in order to be confirmed in their right to eat from the tree of life, yes. And I think it's helpful here for us to distinguish between probation and temptation. God is testing man. Satan is tempting man. Big difference. And as God's testing man, he'd given mankind everything we needed. He made mankind with honor and excellence without any gift lacking, including the ability to keep the law, able to conform in all things to the will of God. Man, however, and now this is language from our Heidelberg Catechism, man at the instigation of the devil in willful disobedience robbed himself and all his descendants of these gifts. Such a helpful phrase. The instigation of the devil and the willful disobedience or the rebellion of man. Those are the two things that we see here. First, the devil's instigation. The beginning of chapter 3, the devil is in conversation with the woman. And we see here that he is the deceiver, the liar. That's what he does. That's who he is. He uses words to twist what is real, to turn the man against God. And we see his craftiness in how he does it. God speaks directly to the man in chapter 2. Why does he do that? Because he's in the position of leadership. There's a created order. God works with this order that he's created. Satan, on the other hand, reaches out to the woman instead, subverting God's order. It's part of his craftiness. And he doesn't force her to eat the fruit. He's much more subtle than that. As he questions, did God really say? This is typical of how he works even today. Not often are people obviously attacked. There are those who, unbelievers who are possessed by demons. There are also believers who are oppressed by demons. And we see that a bit more obviously, but as we think of our lives, by and large, the way that the devil works is subtle in terms of getting you to question God's motives, getting you to question God's commands, getting you to question God's goodness, tempting you towards that. So how do you resist? What's the solution in the face of deception? It's to know the truth. To know the truth, to know it well, and to hold it fast. And this is where we get to the second part of the fallen man's rebellion, his willful disobedience. Chapter 3, verse 6 speaks to this. The Belgic says that he lent his ear to the word of the devil. Now we're talking about the man. We mostly talking about mankind, but now we're talking about his. You're thinking about Adam. It does start with the woman. She's confused. She forgets what God said. She misquotes God as saying they must not even touch the tree. He didn't say that. He just said, don't eat the fruit. And she's tempted. She wants to know good and evil. She wants to be like God. And you say, what's so bad about that? Well, if she does it this way, she won't be learning in God's way. She won't be learning in God's time. She won't be learning for God's purpose. So then actually it's about having power, not praising him. This is the temptation before her, and so she eats. And it's a spectacular failure. A failure to worship the Creator God. Trusting the deceiver, Satan, instead. Trusting the lie of the crafty serpent when he contradicts God's good wisdom and command. But the failure is by no means only on the woman. In fact, it's not primarily on the woman. For it was the man to whom God gave the charge to keep the garden. And so think of it this way. As king in God's kingdom, Adam should have exercised his authority. And as priest in God's temple, Adam should have been more zealous for purity. And so when the serpent approaches Eve and they start talking, and as Adam realizes, my wife's actually considering eating this, what should he have done? He should have killed the serpent right then and there, crushed his head. Instead, when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate. And she also gave some to her husband, who was with her, and he ate.